pay attention to this tactic used by Kelvin Gastelum. This is known as a hop step, and in short, this footwork allows the user to get into range to close a large amount of distance. Kelvin used the hop step to breach his way into range in order to score shots against a good evasive fighter like Israel Adesanya. Now what if I told you Robert Whittaker found a really effective way to counter this tactic? A tactic that Kelvin Gastelum had so much success with against a good fighter. This is just one of the many interesting observations I discovered studying the fight between Robert Whittaker and Kelvin Gastelum. And if you aren't able to catch how he did it, it's okay because I'm going to reveal to you just how he did it soon enough. I've studied these two fighters for a while now, and I've become familiar with their crafts, so going into this fight, I was incredibly curious just how exactly their habits would clash. This fight gave us those answers, and it's a really intriguing technical story I'm about to break down to you to explain how they were able to pull off what they did and the tactics they use. You are not going to want to miss this. Also, Whittaker was landing a combo that's pretty rare and hard to land, and he was doing it in a unique way, so stick around towards the end because I'll explain how he managed to pull this off. Whittaker was in control in all aspects of this fight, and to be honest with you, the best way to describe how this fight went was that Whittaker really did his homework here. For what I was able to observe, the way he was scoring was largely based off of exploiting Gastelum's very specific offensive and defensive habits. It was almost as if his craft was tailor-made to defeat everything good that Kelvin Gastelum did. I've done a video before on Kelvin Gastelum, specifically on how he's able to land his shots despite having inferior reach advantage, and in that video I highlighted a very specific technique you saw at the beginning of this breakdown, where Gastelum uses a hop step. This was a technique Kelvin found a lot of success with closing the distance on Israel Adesanya. Now keep in mind that Adesanya has really good distance management and evasive tendencies, and the fact that Kelvin managed to close the gap says a lot. In order to understand why Whittaker was so effective in countering Kelvin Gastelum, I have to explain to you how the hop step works first. I'll play this clip from my previous analysis explaining it. He uses two different movement styles here to close distance. He uses a traditional step and a hop step. Our traditional step is when you simply step forward with the lead leg and the rear foot trails behind. This is a common form of movement, but it doesn't close a lot of distance. It's a fast balanced movement and is very dependable to use. Now the next step is a hop step. This happens by using the momentum of your entire body to hop forward. This is where the rear foot will swing up and the momentum of the hop has the lead foot trail afterwards. This kind of movement closes a lot of distance, but you're left unbalanced because your foot isn't always properly grounded. So there is one key thing I mentioned in the previous video. I mentioned that one of the drawbacks of this technique is that you're not properly grounded when hop stepping into range. Even though the hop step lets you close an absurd amount of range, it does come with its own risk. Because your feet aren't properly stable when you're hop stepping, there's going to be the potential risk since you're not going to be properly stable momentarily. In fact, Kelvin actually got punished hard using this signature move against Adesanya when he hop stepped into range. So now as Kelvin hops into range, he's gonna land and Adesanya is gonna adjust his feet a little bit to the new spot right there. And as Kelvin hop steps forward, his lead foot needs to follow up to slide while hopping up. But notice that his feet aren't quite grounded fully during this process. With a lot of the momentum moving forward, this allows his leg to collide with Adesanya's leg and he loses balance momentarily. And this gets him punished for leaving an opening. So now that you're aware of one of the drawbacks of not having your feet properly grounded, the next issue is that when your feet aren't properly grounded during the hop step, this means you can't react properly to anything that the opponent does. You see, in order to counter, change direction, or to do anything in general, your feet need to be grounded first. So during a hop step, when you're momentarily airborne or both your feet aren't properly grounded, you can't really do anything and you're pretty helpless until your feet reach the ground. This leaves you susceptible to counters, and this, my friends, is the essence of the fight. Whittaker fully capitalized on this opportunity. In fact, most of the clean shots I was able to observe were mostly from Whittaker capitalizing on punishing Kelvin in the very moments he was advancing mid-air or unable to respond back. For example, when Kelvin hop stepped into range, Rob would time across to counter it. Notice as Kelvin hop steps into range, Whittaker fires his cross at the same exact time frame where Kelvin doesn't have his feet properly set to respond. Kelvin is unable to respond until his feet are properly seated to the ground. Whittaker was also able to counter with a lead hook right over the top of Kelvin's jab as he hop stepped into range as well. Again, you'll notice that with the timing, Whittaker still fires at the exact moment that Kelvin can't properly respond. It wasn't just the cross and the lead hook that was landing, add the jab to the list too, because Whittaker was able to time a jab cross to intercept Kelvin as he hop stepped into range. And again, you'll see that the jab cross follows the same fundamental principle here too. Whittaker times his jab cross right at the same moment that Kelvin is vulnerable as he advances forward. It appears that Whittaker was planning to attack like this the whole time, and I'll let him explain.
A key component was, and part of the strategy that me and my team devised in the month that we had for him was to attack him. It's a small octagon, so I had to play to that. I had to play to that, cater to it, if you would. And the idea was be first, attack, make him pay. If he comes forward, make him pay. If we're standing there, if he's in mid-range, make him pay. And I think that's half the reason why the fight pace was as it was, because I was always in there. Because to take a step backwards was to be cut off. Every time I take a step backwards, I was cut off, had to circle out, and that's when he would go in and try to go heavy. Yeah.
He explains the reason why he was so aggressive was that if he allowed Kelvin to lead, it would have meant Whittaker would have been put on the back foot and cut off. And this makes a lot of sense after studying the fight. For the times that Kelvin led the way as Whittaker was idle, Kelvin put Whittaker on the back foot in a defensive state and forced him to circle away. Conceptually, this would have been a bad idea if Kelvin was able to do this, so it was a good idea from Robert's part to make sure that he didn't have much of these opportunities. Kelvin actually started to catch on that Whittaker was timing counters on his hop step entries. He had to do something to deal with this, so what did he do? He actually started using the hop step on purpose to bait out the counters so he could counter him back. He would do this by hop stepping into range to bait Whittaker's lead hook counters, and then he would dip to avoid the lead hook and then fire his own power shot back to punish the reaction. So here you're going to see Gastelum hop step into range. And then as he hops up into range, he's actually going to bait out that lead hook counter. And then when the lead hook counter comes, Gastelum is actually going to dip his head low to evade it. And then he punishes the reaction by throwing his own power shot. Kelvin did find some minor success using the hop to bait the jab as well in order to counter it with an overhand. Here you see Kelvin hop step slightly and baits Whittaker to do a stepping jab to counter, but Kelvin lands an overhand to counter it. It was a pretty interesting play from Kelvin because it showed he had some awareness of how Whittaker was countering him, and despite Kelvin's efforts, I found that because Whittaker was using such a large variety of counters and landing with really good timing, it was really hard for Kelvin to be consistent. And in order to counter someone, it's pretty helpful to know what they plan on throwing, otherwise it's really difficult to know how you'll actually counter it. Kelvin did also try other methods of countering Whittaker's counter by baiting it with a hop step, then kicking as Whittaker looked to time a counter punch. I thought it was a really interesting way to answer Whittaker's counter, but like I said, Whittaker was throwing so many different counters, it made it really hard to punish him. And Whittaker's timing cross counter, for example, it would just stop Kelvin from hop stepping in the first place, or it would just straight out counter the kick. I wasn't kidding you when I mentioned that Whittaker seemed to have an approach that was tailor-made to counter Kelvin's specific tools. Now there was something else that Whittaker was able to shut down. Let me show you another signature move that Kelvin Gastelum was finding a lot of success with against Israel Adesanya. This counter happens when Adesanya throws his power shot or some kind of straight shot, and Kelvin slips his head off to evade the power hand or the straight shot and then uses the parry to deflect it away. Then he follows it up with a lead hook counter. He found a fair amount of success with this specific counter, but guess what? Whittaker actually found a really effective counter to this tactic too, and he did it with none other than his own infamous signature combo, the jab cross head kick. Here Whittaker is going to throw that jab, flash that cross, and then you're going to see Kelvin try to slip and parry both at the same time, but notice he leaves that head open right for a head kick. And then here Whittaker meets it with his shin, exploits that opening. Whittaker found a ton of consistency when it came to landing this almost every single time Kelvin tried to slip and parry. Kelvin's shin is so durable to this considering Whittaker has rocked so many different opponents with this specific combo. Whittaker was doing so well when it came to landing his counters, but he was also doing exceptionally well when defending and evading Kelvin's offensive attempts. I want to peel back the defensive layers to give you a glimpse of why Whittaker is so good. One of my favorite counters he throws is the lead hook counter. Usually when Kelvin came in to attack, Whittaker would actually pull his head away and fire his lead hook counter to punish Kelvin, but the way he does it was pretty amazing. When he evades his shot, sometimes he'll actually pull his head back to evade the initial shot. However, if for some reason the opponent actually manages to get into that range, he has his secondary defense up. So the opponent goes around the guard, he has that guard up, and if the opponent tries to go straight down the middle, he can actually adjust his rear wall to push it into his center line to cover that center line opening. This sequence has so many layers of defense built in. In fact, there are more layers I haven't mentioned yet, but for the sake of time, I want to get to the important part here. When Whittaker pulls his head away, he pulls his head back while squaring up the shoulders. Now to square shoulders up, that means your shoulders become more horizontal rather than linear. So like right here, you see the shoulders are more linear pointing towards Gastelum, but when he moves his shoulders, you see it's more squared up where it's more horizontal to the opponent. When you use this pull style, this actually puts your lead shoulder in position to fire immediately right away because your shoulders are squared up. That means that your lead hook is chambered and ready to fire right away. So by using this pull style, you can accomplish two things. You can effectively evade damage and chamber the lead hook both at the same time. Now, this is kind of a square pull, so when you pull your head away in this manner, it squares up the shoulders. Another important detail to keep in mind is that Kelvin was often moving to Whittaker's weak side, which is the ankle outside of Whittaker's lead foot. However, the lead hook is actually a nice natural counter to help cover that weak spot, so Whittaker was actually able to connect even if Kelvin managed to move to that angle. Whittaker uses to counter Kelvin multiple times, but I thought it was worth mentioning to highlight how defensively sound and offensively effective this signature counter was. There's one particular combo that Whittaker threw that really caught my eye, and it's because it's a combo that's rarely used. Now, it wasn't quite a defining part of the story, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it was cool enough and I thought it deserved its own segment to talk about here. Whittaker had a really nice stiff jab, and he didn't really have a hard time picking at Kelvin with it either. One of the nice tactics he's used is hooking off the jab while exiting off at angle. Now this basically works by firing a straight jab, then following up with a lead hook. The idea is that the jab can blind or stun the opponent to adjust the guard in a way that opens him up for a following lead hook. The lead hook is rarely ever expected after the jab, so when it comes, it tends to throw the opponent off. One of the main concerns with hooking off the jab is that fighters don't always feel comfortable using the lead hook after firing the jab, and that's because the transition between the jab and the lead hook, there's usually a period where you have to chamber the arm back into position to fire again, and during this time, fighters usually feel vulnerable due to the possible counters during this transition. You rarely see fighters attempt this, but Whittaker had nice moments of throwing this where you'd see him pull out with a jab and finish with the check hook. There's one specific reason why he gets away with pulling this off: footwork. Let me just try to explain to you a little simple process of why fighters tend to feel uncomfortable hooking off the jab. For simplicity, let's look at hooking off the jab in 3 easy steps. First, you have the jab, and then you have the chambering of the arm back into position, and then you actually fire the lead hook afterwards, the last step. Step 2 is where fighters feel vulnerable, just like I mentioned before, because during this time they have to chamber the arm back. That's the window of time where they could potentially eat counters. One more thing before I explain how Whittaker hooks off the jab, I first need to explain how a check hook works. The check hook is often defined in different ways, but a more boxing-centric definition, the check hook is described as throwing the lead hook while exiting off at an angle. Now, one of the ways to accomplish this is by throwing the check hook while pivoting off. And when you pivot, your body acts like a door opening up. So imagine yourself trying to punch a door as it swings open and away from you. Now, this works fundamentally how a check hook works. As you throw the lead hook, the body pivots and opens up like a door. Watch as Whittaker throws his check hook, and notice that if Kelvin throws his straight shot or some kind of circular shot, he's going to be aiming for that position. But as you actually throw the check hook, you pivot away, watch the head, it's actually going to move away from that position, like it's opening up like a door moving away, and you notice that Kelvin misses his shot. So this is just an alternate example from sparring where you could use the pivot to open the body up like a door. So if a straight shot comes, you could still pivot away, and you'll notice that I can bypass a straight shot like a door opening. The check hook was pretty useful in this fight, and we saw Whittaker land this multiple times to counter Kelvin. Now that you know the idea behind the pivot, I can finally explain to you why Whittaker's footwork adds an additional defensive layer that allows him to hook off the jab a little bit more reliably. When you see a normal execution of hooking off the jab, this is what you normally see. You see the jab, the chambering of the arm, and then the lead hook afterwards. But when you look at Whittaker's process, this is the process that you see. You have a jab, then you see him chamber the arm but also pivot at the same time, and then he fires that check hook. When Whittaker throws a jab, he follows up by simultaneously chambering the arm and pivoting at the same time. Now this is absolutely crucial because by adding the pivot with the chambering of the arm, this actually adds a defensive layer that allows you to protect yourself in a more reliable way compared to not having a defensive process during the chambering of the arm. So Whittaker is going to throw that jab, and as he throws that jab, he's actually going to slide his rear foot over, and this is the pivot that happens that allows his upper body to follow up like it's opening with the door. So notice that Kelvin's going to throw a shot, but the head's going to pivot open like a door, so even if the shot lands, it's going to mitigate some of that force. Notice as he throws a check hook, he's going to slide again and pivot, and it allows his head to again pivot and open up like a door again, and this allows him to bypass that shot. Now it doesn't hit the head directly, at least where the chin is, but it does mitigate some of that force by opening up an angle where he's more defensive. The mixture of footwork here is pretty cool because it's like he's throwing a check jab and following it up with another check hook, so it's like a double pivot that's happening. And in these compilations here, you're going to see him throw a jab, and then you'll see him do a slight pivot too, and then chamber and throw that check hook. The main idea I want to highlight here is that one of the styles of executing a hooking off the jab is by having a defensive component during the time frame when you're chambering the arm. Now there's other styles you could do it too, some where you could just not fully chamber the arm back, that way you could strike with the hook sooner. And there's so many different ways of doing it, you just kind of do what works for you. But for Whittaker's sake, he's using a defensive component when he chambers the arm by using a pivot at the same time. Here's an alternate example to show this concept. It's not quite the same as the previous example, but in this example, Sugar Ray Robinson, he's going to poke with a jab, and he'll actually chamber the lead hand back and pull back into a safe position at the same time. So the pull back is kind of the defensive portion that allows him to chamber safely. Then from there he fires that lead hook. But the main principle that I'm trying to get here is that hooking out the jab can be done in a style where you have a defensive component accompanying the time frame where you have to chamber the arm back. I need to mention that there's several different ways to hook off the jab, and there's some more principles here that you can follow in order to land it more reliably, and I won't really go into those details much here, but just know that there's so many different ways to do it, and you just kind of do what works for you. And then one more thing is when using Whittaker's style while you're pivoting, you gotta kind of be careful with the pivot because this is a game of inches, and the opponent can adjust their timing and adjust their reach a little bit more, so things like this aren't always perfect, and you do see things happen where people get caught even during pivots sometimes. I mean, you can even see when Whittaker does the pivots too that the shots will sometimes land, but it misses a direct hit on the chin because Whittaker is using a defensive pivot to move the head just inches away. So you gotta be careful with things like that because stuff could still land because you are playing a game of inches after all, like I said. Another thing worth mentioning is that even if you do get caught for a shot while you're pivoting, a nice thing is that it does help mitigate some of the force because you're actually moving away from the force. Whittaker was controlled in this fight everywhere. Even in the grappling exchanges, Kelvin just couldn't really do much at all. Whittaker was always quick to neutralize his high crotch takedowns attempts or just stop Kelvin before he could even establish the steps that he needed to finish the takedowns. Overall, the story of this fight was dictated by the fact that Whittaker had really effective counters for Kelvin's most meaningful habits. When Kelvin attempted this signature hop step, for example, Whittaker would always counter it with a barrage of several different counters. when Kelvin tried his signature parry slip and hook counter, Whittaker had something to punish that with his own jab cross combo. Simply put, Whittaker showed that he had the edge wherever Kelvin looked to challenge him. The other unique thing about Whittaker is that his striking always seems to vary a bit. Depending on who the opponent is, it appears that he specifically orients his approach to whatever the opponent's attributes are. For example, in his fight with Yo Romero and Darren Till, he used a lot of side kicks to the knee, but against Gastelum, those attacks were completely absent, and it's because he didn't really need them at all to accomplish the job. With a mixture of various striking tools and a dangerous understanding of the rhythm to the opponent's specific habits, it shows that Whittaker's IQ makes him such a dangerous threat to the division, and the way he's able to solve certain technical challenges is a feat worthy of admiration. It looks like Whittaker is on his way to a rematch with the champ Israel Adesanya. So how do you think the fight will go? And also, what changes do you think Whittaker needs to make in order to avoid the mistakes that he made last time? Whittaker has racked up a lot of wins since his loss to Israel Adesanya, but what do his recent wins really say about his growth? And has he been improving the specific situations that got him in trouble with Israel Adesanya? And I hope you enjoyed this video. I really appreciate all the shares and the support that you all have been giving. And make sure to hit the bell notification for the next installment of tactics and technical stories for next time.